James Carter grips the steering wheel tightly, his eyes heavy from exhaustion as his truck hums quietly along the deserted road. It's been a long day at the garage, another day of hard work with grease under his nails and the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He rubs his eyes, trying to shake the fatigue. The road stretches out before him, empty and dark, save for the dim glow of his headlights cutting through the night. Suddenly, in the distance, a flicker of orange catches his attention. Flames. His heart skips a beat as he rounds the bend, and there it is, a car, overturned, flames creeping from beneath the hood, smoke curling into the sky. Without a second thought, James pulls over, his instincts kicking in. He doesn't pause to think about the danger, the risk, or the fact that the wreck is clearly beyond saving. The smell of burning fuel fills his lungs as he rushes toward the vehicle. The heat hits him like a wave, the fire roaring louder with every second. His mind races, scanning the wreckage. Through the shattered window, he sees a figure slumped over the steering wheel, motionless. James's gut tightens. Whoever's in there doesn't have long. He pulls his jacket sleeve over his hand, smashing the glass with a rock he grabs from the roadside. The shards fall to the ground, tinkling like broken promises. As he leans into the wreck, he sees the face of the man inside, Officer John Reynolds, the cop who patrols their town, the same one who's known for his hard stance on law and order. James hesitates. It's not just any person trapped in that car. It's a cop. And not just a cop, but one who represents a system James knows too well, one that has caused tension, pain, and fear in his community. His heart pounds in his chest as he stares at Reynolds, who is unconscious, blood trailing down his face. James swallows, the knot of uncertainty tightening in his throat. Walk away, a voice whispers in his mind. Let it be someone else's problem. But he can't. Not tonight. Not when a life is hanging in the balance. James shakes the thought from his head. He's not the kind of man who lets another die, no matter who they are. The flames snap louder, the fire edging closer. Time's running out. He grabs Reynolds under the arms, pulling with all his strength. The officer's body is heavy, limp like a sack of bricks, but James digs deep, using every bit of muscle and will he has. Sweat beads on his forehead as the fire inches closer to the leaking gas tank. James grits his teeth, dragging Reynolds inch by inch, every movement a battle against the growing heat and the danger looming closer. With a final heave, James pulls the officer free, falling backward onto the gravel, Reynolds on top of him. They're out, but just barely. And then, in an instant, the car erupts behind them, a deafening explosion that sends a shockwave through the air, flames shooting skyward. James shields Reynolds with his body, instinctively protecting the man he just saved. For a moment, everything is still. The fire crackles behind them, the wreck a smoldering ruin. James lies there, catching his breath, his mind racing. He saved him. He saved a cop. The realization hits him like a second wave, washing over him with a strange mix of emotions, relief, exhaustion, and a deeper, more complex feeling he can't quite name. James looks down at the officer's unconscious face. He wonders if Reynolds will even remember this. If he'll ever understand the irony of being saved by someone from the very community his badge has symbolized distrust toward. James wipes the sweat and soot from his brow, getting to his feet. The sirens wail in the distance. Emergency vehicles are on their way, the flashing lights just barely visible on the horizon. James glances back at the burning wreckage, then at Reynolds, still lying on the ground, barely conscious but alive. Quietly, James walks back to his truck. He doesn't need to be here when the cops show up. He doesn't want to explain why he, of all people, stopped. He doesn't want to talk about why he risked his life for a man who represents everything he's learned to be wary of. No one would understand. Hell, he's not even sure he understands it himself. Without looking back, James climbs into his truck and drives away, disappearing into the night as the sirens grow louder. The heat of the fire fades in his rearview mirror, but the weight of what just happened stays with him, pressing on his chest like a weight he wasn't expecting to carry. As the night closes in around him, James doesn't know what tomorrow holds. But he knows this: the world isn't black and white. It's messy, complicated, full of decisions that leave a mark, decisions that twist and turn, setting off a chain of events you can't see coming. The next morning, word spreads fast. James wakes up to a flood of messages, texts, voicemails, social media blowing up. Everyone seems to know what he did. His name is on the local news, though he never wanted the attention. A quiet man by nature, James doesn't know what to make of it. His phone keeps buzzing, but he leaves it on the kitchen counter, trying to go about his morning like usual. Yet, he can't avoid the growing noise outside. At the shop, a few regulars come by, offering praise. "You're a hero," one says, patting him on the back. Another shakes his head, giving a low chuckle. "Risking your neck for a cop? Man, I don't know." The divide is clear. While some of his neighbors celebrate his bravery, others aren't so sure he made the right call. The wounds between the police and the community run deep, and many can't shake the feeling that James saved someone who wouldn't have done the same for him. It leaves a bitter taste in the air, one James can't quite ignore. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Officer John Reynolds slowly regains consciousness. The sterile white room spins as he blinks against the harsh fluorescent light. His body aches, the crash still fresh in his mind, but the details are blurry. He remembers the fire, the heat, and then, nothing. A nurse comes in, checking his vitals, mentioning something that makes him pause. "You're lucky," she says. "If that man hadn't pulled you out when he did, you wouldn't be here." She explains how James Carter, the mechanic, risked his life to save him. Reynolds processes this with difficulty. James, the man who pulled him from the wreckage, is black, a member of a community Reynolds knows he hasn't always treated with the empathy he should. The weight of this realization settles over him like a heavy blanket. Gratitude, yes, but also guilt. He knows his position. Knows what he represents, especially to men like James. Reynolds decides he needs to meet James, to thank him personally. It takes some effort, but he tracks down James's number and arranges to visit him. When they finally meet, there's an awkwardness that hangs between them. Reynolds fumbles through his thanks, but the words don't come out as smoothly as he'd hoped. "I owe you my life," he says, his voice betraying a mix of discomfort and humility. James listens, nodding, but his expression is unreadable. The conversation is stiff, formal. James is polite but distant, never really letting the conversation dive too deep. They both know there's more beneath the surface, unspoken things lingering between them. Years of systemic tension, unspoken grievances, all condensed into this brief interaction. Reynolds isn't sure what else to say. He feels the weight of James's gaze. There's no anger, but there's no warmth either. Just distance. James has done what he felt was right, but that doesn't erase everything else. Reynolds leaves, unsettled, unsure of what exactly he expected. Gratitude? Forgiveness? It's not that simple. The past doesn't get erased just because one man saved another's life. The encounter stays with him, though, sitting in his chest like a question he doesn't have the answer to. Later that night, James is sitting at home, trying to push the day's events out of his mind. He's done talking about it. As far as he's concerned, it's over. He saved the man, he did what anyone should have done, and that's that. He's ready to move on. But then, the phone rings. It's not a number he recognizes. He almost doesn't answer, but something makes him pick up. On the other end, a voice, low, smooth, and completely unfamiliar. The tone is calm, almost too calm. The caller doesn't waste any time with pleasantries. They get right to the point. "We appreciate what you did for Officer Reynolds," the voice says. "But we need you to keep quiet about certain details." James tenses up, his brow furrowing. The voice continues, casually mentioning a sum of money, more than James would make in a year, all for keeping his mouth shut about the specifics of the crash. No more questions. Just silence. The offer is generous, too generous, and it leaves a cold knot forming in James's stomach. He interrupts, demanding to know who this is, but the caller brushes off the question, as if it's irrelevant. It's in your best interest, the voice says, a thinly veiled threat woven into their words. Take the money. Forget the rest. The call ends abruptly, leaving James staring at his phone, the silence in his house now deafening. He feels a rising unease, a sense that something much larger is at play. What could be so important that someone would pay him to stay quiet? His mind races, piecing together the fragments. This was no ordinary car crash. And if someone's going to these lengths to cover it up, then whatever happened that night is far more dangerous than he imagined. James puts the phone down, but the tension stays with him. The night feels heavier now, the shadows in his home stretching longer. He doesn't know what's coming, but he's sure of one thing: it's far from over. James couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he stepped outside, it felt like unseen eyes were tracking his every move. The anonymous phone call played over and over in his head, like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Why would anyone pay him to keep quiet about an accident? What were they hiding? The questions ate at him, so he did the only thing he could: he started digging. He returned to the crash site late at night, when the road was quiet again. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he scanned the area for anything the investigators might have missed. He wasn't a cop, but years as a mechanic taught him how to spot things out of place. As he crouched by the blackened asphalt, he saw something, the faintest trace of skid marks, sharp and intentional, as if someone had run Reynolds off the road. The realization hit hard. This wasn't an accident. It was a hit, a calculated move to take Reynolds out. His heart raced as the pieces started to fall into place. But why? What had Reynolds gotten himself into that was worth killing him over? Back home, James spent hours searching online, piecing together what little public information he could find about Reynolds. He kept coming back to one thing: corruption. Whispers of shady dealings inside the police department, rumors about certain city officials turning a blind eye to organized crime in the area. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And suddenly, the money offered to him for silence made a lot more sense. James knew he couldn't keep this to himself. As much as he wanted to walk away and protect his daughter from whatever this was, he was already in too deep. He had to confront Reynolds. When James called the officer to meet up again, Reynolds hesitated but eventually agreed. They met in a quiet park at dusk, far from any prying eyes. The conversation began as strained as their last meeting, but this time, James wasn't holding back. "That crash," James said, looking Reynolds straight in the eye. "It wasn't an accident." Reynolds stiffened. He didn't respond immediately, but his face told James that he already knew. After a long pause, Reynolds sighed, rubbing a hand across his tired face. "I wasn't sure how much you'd figured out," he admitted. "But you're right. It wasn't an accident. They tried to kill me." James pressed for more. "Who? And why? What's going on?" Reynolds looked around cautiously before answering. "I've been investigating something, off the books, for months now. Corruption in the department, the mayor's office, you name it. It started with missing funds, then I started connecting the dots. It's bigger than I thought. There are people in this town running things behind the scenes: drug trafficking, money laundering, all of it. The people who are supposed to protect this town are the ones tearing it apart." Reynolds paused, his voice low and tense. "I found proof. Enough to bring them down. But someone found out I was looking, and that's when things got dangerous." James felt the weight of it all settle on his shoulders. He'd saved Reynolds from more than just a car wreck. He'd pulled him out of a much larger fire, one that had now spread to his own life. They started working together in secret, following the trail of breadcrumbs Reynolds had uncovered before the crash. Documents, emails, phone calls, it was all there, proof that the town's leaders were involved in a vast web of illegal activity. The mayor, the police chief, even some of the wealthiest businessmen in town, they were all in on it. The more they dug, the more dangerous it became. James could feel the walls closing in around them. There were signs, cars that followed him too closely, strangers loitering near his house. The paranoia grew. He knew that by saving Reynolds, he had inadvertently put himself and his daughter at risk. Every night he double-checked the locks, kept an eye on the streets from his window. His heart raced every time his phone rang, fearing it would be another threatening voice on the other end. Reynolds, too, was struggling. He had always believed in the system, in the idea that justice would prevail if he just played by the rules. But now, he was realizing how deeply broken that system was. The very people he trusted, the ones he'd sworn to serve alongside, were the ones orchestrating this corruption. It gnawed at him, the guilt, the realization that he had been a part of something so rotten for so long without even knowing it. One night, while poring over a particularly damning set of documents, James looked up from the papers and saw the same conflict in Reynolds' eyes. "You ever think, if I hadn't saved you, none of this would have happened?" Reynolds shook his head. "If you hadn't saved me, they'd still be running this town into the ground, and no one would know. You did the right thing." James didn't respond, but the words didn't bring much comfort. The right thing had come with a heavy price, and he wasn't sure if either of them was ready to pay it. He thought about his daughter, about what would happen if these people came after them. The thought sent a chill down his spine. As the days passed, the danger became more real. They both knew it was only a matter of time before the people they were chasing realized how close they were to the truth. James felt the pressure mounting, the fear clawing at him every minute. But now that they had come this far, there was no turning back. This was bigger than either of them, bigger than their personal histories, their differences. It wasn't just about a black man saving a white cop anymore. It was about tearing down the walls of corruption that had been built around them for so long. It was about justice, the kind that couldn't be bought, silenced, or threatened. But with every step forward, James couldn't shake the growing feeling that they were running out of time. And the deeper they got, the higher the stakes became. James's world flipped when he got the call. At first, it was just static, a low hum on the other end. He thought it might be another one of those cryptic threats, but this time, a voice followed, sharp, deliberate, and chillingly clear. "Your daughter," the voice said, pausing just long enough for his heart to drop. "She's a sweet kid. Be a shame if anything happened to her." He gripped the phone tighter, barely able to breathe. His eyes darted to the living room where his daughter, Lily, sat innocently coloring, unaware of the darkness circling them. The fear was immediate, primal. He hung up, his hand shaking. For all the risks he'd taken up to this point, nothing had prepared him for this. He wasn't just playing with his own life anymore. These people were ruthless enough to target his child. James felt sick. How had it come to this? One act of bravery had dragged him into something far more dangerous than he ever imagined. He didn't have the luxury of indecision now. It wasn't about finding the truth or uncovering corruption anymore. It was about survival, about protecting his family. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. He wanted to grab Lily and run, disappear somewhere safe. But there was no safe place now, not with these people involved. He called Reynolds immediately, his voice low, trying to keep the panic in check. "They threatened my daughter," he said. There was a pause on the other end, then Reynolds' voice came through, steady but grim. "I'll be there soon." They met at James's garage, the one place where they wouldn't be overheard. James paced, the tension in his body palpable. When Reynolds arrived, he looked worse than usual, tired, beaten down by the weight of what they were up against. But there was something else in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. Determination. "We need to end this," James said, his voice hard. "This isn't just about us anymore." Reynolds nodded, but James could see the internal conflict playing out in the officer's mind. "I didn't sign up for this either," Reynolds said, his voice quiet but firm. "But it's gone too far. I'm with you." James didn't know how much he trusted Reynolds yet, but in this moment, they were all each other had. The two of them were in too deep, and now, it was clear that the people behind the conspiracy weren't just pulling strings. They were ready to kill to keep their power intact. As they planned their next move, an unexpected visitor arrived, Mayor Evelyn Brooks. Her polished exterior did nothing to mask the cold calculation in her eyes. She wasn't there for small talk. She looked at James with an expression that could cut steel. I've heard you've been busy, she said, voice dripping with authority. She barely glanced at Reynolds, as if his presence didn't matter. All her attention was on James. Let me be clear. Walk away. Right now. You'll live. Your family will live. You stay quiet, and I'll make sure this all goes away. Think about your daughter, James. James felt the weight of her words, the thinly veiled threat hanging in the air. His chest tightened, but he didn't waver. And if I don't? The mayor's smile was cold, predatory. You know what will happen. We've already given you a taste. James stared her down. Every instinct in him screamed to take the deal, to protect his family and forget about the truth. But something inside him refused. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up to the people who thought they could destroy lives without consequence. He couldn't live with himself if he backed down now. No deal, James said, his voice firm, though his stomach churned with fear. Brooks's eyes narrowed, but she remained calm. Suit yourself. But when this ends badly, remember, you made the choice. She left without another word, her warning lingering like a dark cloud. The moment she was gone, Reynolds turned to James, his face pale. She's not bluffing, you know that, right? This could get ugly fast. James nodded. I know. But I can't let them win. Not like this. Reynolds looked at him, something shifting in his expression. For the first time, James saw a man who wasn't just a cop caught in the middle. Reynolds was starting to believe in what they were doing. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was seeing someone like James, a man who had every reason to walk away but didn't. Whatever it was, Reynolds was all in now. We need more than just what we've got, Reynolds said, urgency in his voice. If we're going to take them down, we need solid proof. They worked late into the night, following every lead, tracing every shadowy connection. They knew the mayor's hands were dirty, but without something concrete, they were just two men against a powerful system. Then they found it. Hidden deep within a series of financial ledgers, coded and disguised as routine government expenses, was the smoking gun, a direct link between the mayor and several illegal deals with known criminals. It was everything they needed. As they stared at the evidence, exhaustion pulled at them both, but there was a new tension now, one born of urgency. They had what they needed, but they also knew that time was running out. The mayor and her cronies weren't going to let them expose this without a fight. They were close, so close to tearing the whole corrupt operation apart, but every second they held on to that evidence was another second their enemies were closing in. James felt the weight of what was coming. It wasn't just his life or Reynolds's at stake, it was his daughter's future. They both knew the next step was the most dangerous one, but there was no turning back now. The only question left was whether they could survive long enough to make it count. James could feel the tension in the air as he and Reynolds approached the old warehouse. This was where the mayor and her associates had conducted their shady deals, where the darkest corners of their town's corruption had taken root. It was fitting that the final confrontation would take place here, in the shadows. For James, this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about confronting the people who thought they could ruin lives without consequence. And for Reynolds, it was about redemption, about making up for the years he'd spent looking the other way. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with anticipation. Mayor Brooks stood with a couple of her trusted goons, all of them armed with arrogance, and the belief that they could control everything and everyone. James had expected this. He knew the mayor wouldn't go down without a fight. But this time, he wasn't backing down either. As they stepped forward, Brooks's voice cut through the tension. "You've made a huge mistake," she said, her eyes locking onto James. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a mechanic in over his head." James kept his gaze steady, ignoring the fear gnawing at him. "I'm not the one who's scared," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You are. That's why you went after my daughter." Brooks didn't even flinch. She gestured lazily, and one of her men dragged Lily into view, a small, terrified figure in a sea of danger. James's heart clenched at the sight of her, but he forced himself to stay focused. This was what they wanted, for him to lose control, to act out of fear. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. Reynolds stood beside him, his hand instinctively moving toward the concealed evidence. "Let her go, Brooks," Reynolds said, his voice steady but sharp. "We've got everything we need to expose you. This ends here." The mayor's eyes flickered with anger, but she didn't back down. "You think anyone's going to believe you?" she sneered. "I control this town. You're nothing but a washed-up cop and a nobody." But James didn't let her words shake him. He looked at Lily, her wide eyes filled with fear, and felt his resolve harden. He was done being pushed around, done letting people like the mayor think they could do whatever they wanted. In a quick, calculated move, James signaled Reynolds, and the two sprang into action. The corrupt officials hadn't anticipated their determination. Reynolds distracted the guards, creating just enough chaos for James to slip through the cracks. His focus never wavered as he rushed toward Lily, grabbing her and pulling her out of harm's way. The rescue was swift, but not without its dangers. Gunfire erupted, but James moved quickly, shielding Lily with his body, knowing that every step he took towards safety could be his last. For a brief moment, everything hung in the balance: lives, justice, the future of his daughter. It was as if time slowed, the weight of every decision pressing down on him. But James had come too far to fail now. He and Reynolds managed to get Lily out of the warehouse, the night air cool and sharp against the heat of the danger they'd just escaped. But it wasn't over yet. As they regrouped outside, James realized they still had one final card to play: the evidence. The ledger they'd uncovered was the key to bringing everything crashing down. It was the proof that could take the mayor and her whole operation out for good. They knew going public with it would be dangerous. The mayor still had power, still had the ability to reach them even outside the law. But James and Reynolds had made their choice long before this moment. They were in too deep now to turn back. Reynolds looked at James, a mix of admiration and determination in his eyes. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, knowing full well that once they made the call, there was no going back. James nodded without hesitation. "It's the only way," he said quietly. "People like her don't get to win." The next few hours were a blur of tense phone calls and dangerous moves. They contacted every major news outlet, sent the evidence to journalists, and blew the lid off the entire conspiracy. The town was rocked by the revelations: Mayor Brooks, the corrupt officials, the secret deals. It all came crashing down in a whirlwind of scandal and outrage. The aftermath was chaotic, but clear. Brooks and her associates were arrested, the town's dark underbelly exposed for all to see. But it came at a price. James knew that this fight had changed him forever. He wasn't just the quiet mechanic who kept to himself anymore. He had become something else, something stronger, something braver. But it wasn't glory he sought. He had done what was necessary, and that was enough. As the dust settled, Reynolds made a decision of his own. He resigned from the police force, tired of the weight of complicity that had hung over him for so long. He didn't know where he'd go next, but for once, he felt like he could breathe. He and James stood together, two men who had started on opposite sides, now bound by the fight they had shared. "You did good," Reynolds said, offering a hand. James took it, a brief handshake passing between them. "You too." There was no need for words after that. They both knew what they had been through, what they had risked. As Reynolds walked away, James turned back toward his garage, where Lily waited for him. She ran up, hugging him tightly, and for the first time in days, James felt a sense of peace. Life wouldn't go back to normal. Not entirely. The town had been changed by what had happened, and so had he. But as he walked back to his quiet life, James knew that he had done the right thing, even when it had been the hardest thing. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.